Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition, we have around a round table today. Two women that are broadcasters and commentators, and they are joining us as they oftentimes do. Penna, Dexter, and Debbie Georgatos. And if you would like to join our conversation a little bit later, we'll open up the phones. Might just mention we have information about both of them so you can read some of their commentaries and things, and also Debbie's book. But we're going to get right into the topics today. A lot of them under the letter I. We're going to talk about Iraq and Israel and immigration, the IRS, and those are just the starters. So we've got lots to talk about today, don't we, Penna?
Yeah, I added to the mix last night as I was looking for a common theme, which I always do, the imperial presidency, which kind of runs through all of it. But Kerby, I guess we could start with the good news today.
Let's go for it, yes.
Well, Miriam Abraham, who is the young woman, 27 years old, who was imprisoned in Sudan for being a Christian, basically marrying a Christian. She actually bore a child in the Sudanese prison. She was released, but then she was not released from the country, and people kept working on it. And I was so interested in this because, you know, the Family Research Council, which are great friends of Point of View, often work on family values and religious liberty issues, and they were out there really working hard to get her released, along with various members of Congress like Chris Smith, Mark Meadows, and also John Boehner, Speaker, and some senators. And you're going to have Frank Wolf on next week, I think, to talk about these issues. But the idea that if we say that we're really for religious liberty, it's not just in this country. We can't allow these things to happen in places where we actually do have an influence, because Miriam's husband is a U.S. citizen. She's now been released, and she's also left Sudan with her family and gone to Italy. So we can say that's a victory.
You know, it was kind of an on-again, off-again situation. I remember I was in upstate New York at the time when we heard for the first time that she was actually going to leave, and then she ends up in the embassy, and she's still been sitting in Sudan until yesterday. So you just never can trust that government, and I'm glad that the prison chains are off of her in Khartoum, and she's in Italy. But I'd love to get your comments, Debbie, as well.
Obviously, I'm celebrating with every American about to just very grateful for her release. And, you know, I do think it helps Americans look at the founding of our country and the idea of Judeo-Christian values and genuine respect for freedom of religion, and to be really clear in the contrast between that and what people experience in other countries where they don't have that. And so I hope it helps us all celebrate freedom of religion in America and standing up for the rights of each person to pursue their own religious path. And I'm very proud of all the Christian groups in America that got on board and just made a lot of noise about we have to speak up because these things aren't right.
One of the other people I'd certainly like to applaud, and of course Penna went through a pretty long list, but Ted Cruz was at most of the events that I saw. Tony Perkins gets high marks and was on the Fox News the other day talking about this, wasn't he?
He was with Megyn Kelly, and she really credited Tony and FRC with their hard work on this. And some of the others also would be Roy Blunt, and I'll mention Mary Landrieu of Louisiana. They were working on this along with Ted Cruz and Frank Wolf and Trent Franks, who's been also an advocate for religious liberty around the world.
Well, lots of things that we can talk there. And, of course, we still want to think of some of the others that are in difficult situations as well. But that's a good lead into what we'll be talking about next week for a while with Frank Wolf, because he has also spoken out about the fate of Christians in Iraq. And I think most of us have in front of us here the Christian purge from Mosul. This is disturbing, and it is something that even the secular media has been picking up on recognizing that you've had Christians that have been living in places like Iraq, and then some left Iraq going to Syria. Well, that was from bad to worse. Others have found themselves being driven from the homes, and a lot of that happened before ISIS showed up, but now the complete purge of Christians from Mosul. Your thoughts?
Well, there's this leader, and Muhammad Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he calls himself the Caliph Ibrahim. Mm-hmm. So that's scary enough when you think about it, because what they really want to do is cleanse the area of Christians, and they're presenting this option that you either convert or die or pay this huge tax. And so that's what they're doing now. And the Christians, Mosul is a historic city where there are many Christian churches, and these Christians are just being forced to leave now.
Yeah, and again, this is coming from the Quran, because there are statements in the Quran that individuals who have not accepted the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad have to feel themselves subdued. And so that's the idea of dhimmitude, and they are called dhimmis. And if indeed they are allowed to stay in a Muslim country, then they have to pay a jizya, or a tax. And that has been implemented in the past, and Christians were always, and Jews were always second-class citizens. But now you can see what kind of a true, literal interpretation of the Quran, kind of a fundamentalist caliphate looks like, and they are trying to implement that right now in Iraq. Debbie?
Absolutely. And, in America, it's so hard for people living in America to think that these kind of things happen in modern times. We live in a free society, in a free country, and it's almost surreal to imagine that this is happening at the same time we have all the freedoms we have here. Back to the story about the release of Miriam Abraham just a moment, it shows what speaking up does,
yes,
and making a public outcry, and the same thing needs to happen here with respect to Mosul. And the Western world, the civilized world, all over the world needs to speak up and say that we don't do this anymore. We're in the modern times, and it is obviously horrific what's happening to the Christian population over there, and it's a window open to all of us to help see what will happen if we are not firm in standing up to radical Islam.
I think it just also goes to the entire foreign policy of this president, because things are just sort of disintegrating right now. And, as far as in Syria, remember, it was just about a year ago, he set a red line, and then he got delivered from that by Putin, who's now taking advantage of us big time. And we're not standing up again. So we have developed this weak foreign policy, and so that's why Al-Qaeda, who we did make some progress against, is now being replaced by this other group, ISIS. And not only are they causing people to flee because they're Christians, on the way out they're taking everything they own.
Right.
So this is something that the United States bears responsibility for partially. I know that the Quran has influenced this, but we have an influence in Iraq, and we've squandered it.
That's one of the questions, again, back to Debbie's comment about maybe trying to get some, at least, of the more moderate Muslims to speak out against this. It will relate to something we're going to talk about in just a minute. A lot of people have been saying, how is it that Israel's been now going into the 18th day going against Hamas? Because most of the, quote, wars that Israel's been involved in, 6-day war, a few days, and then by that time, Syria, Egypt, somebody jumps in and says, we're going to stop this. And they haven't this time. And I think it's because some of the more moderate Muslims are recognizing they face a true threat from some of these fundamentalist groups. The ruling class in Saudi Arabia, the royal family. I mean, if the radicals really took over, they're all gone. We almost had the Muslim Brotherhood completely take over Egypt. And so you're starting to sense that other Muslims are saying, if this heads down the road, they won't just be going after the Christians. They won't be just going after the Jews. They'll be going after us too. And of course, ISIS, like right now, when they find some of the even Shiite Muslims, they'll just kill them on the spot. So we're talking about a purge, something that we've never seen before. But we need to take a break. We come back, we'll continue our talking about what's happened in the Middle East and also move into what has been happening in Israel. That ongoing battle is still taking place, the battle between Israel and Hamas. Later, we're going to talk about immigration and many other topics. Lots to go. We'll be back right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
We have a problem when it comes to understanding the numbers we use when talking about trillions of dollars in government spending and our national debt. Most of us have no mental category for the word trillion. When I talk about it, I try to explain how big the number is by saying that a trillion is 1,000 billion. I don't know if that helps, but here are some other ideas. A few years ago, Jeremy Harper made news when he counted to 1 million in front of a webcam. He took some sleep breaks, so it took him 89 days. But a million is really a very small number. 1 trillion is actually 1 million million. If someone wanted to count to a trillion, counting one number per second and taking no breaks, it would take him 32,000 years. Here's another example. America has not even been around a trillion seconds. As a matter of fact, Western civilization has not been around a trillion seconds. For that matter, all of recorded history is less than a trillion seconds. To understand trillion, you probably need to use examples from astronomy. How long would it take to travel 1 trillion miles? Even traveling at the speed of light, it would take 2 months. However, if you took 1 trillion $1 bills and laid them end to end, they would reach from the Earth to the Sun. And while we're using astronomical illustrations, let's consider our own galaxy. Our solar system is just an incredibly small part of the Milky Way galaxy. Some estimate that our galaxy has about 100 billion stars, although some say even more. But if we use the number 100 billion, we would need 10 galaxies like the Milky Way to equal 1 trillion stars. I think you get the point. We've lost track of how big these numbers are, and it's worth remembering the next time you hear that the federal budget is $3.5 trillion and the national debt is over $17 trillion. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Penna, Dexter, Georgatos with us today, and if you'd like to join our conversation, it is our weekend edition. At any point, we'll open up the phones and, of course, give you a chance to join our conversation. Talked about the Middle East and certainly some good news as we've talked about the release of Miriam Ibrahim, and she is now in Italy and on her way to America, as I understand. And we also have talked a little bit about this purge of Christians and others from Mosul and really what is happening in the Middle East. And so what a setup for what is now taking place in Israel. One of the concerns I had as somebody that may be traveling over there is that the FAA decided that they would ban travel to Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion Airport. That, to me, Penna, looked a little bit like overreaction, and if nothing else, as I think some have been saying, it's a good example of the terrorist win. If the goal of terrorism is to disrupt normal activity, and if the goal of terrorism is to punish people economically, as the destroying of the World Trade Towers, or in this case, the disruption of the significant income that comes from tourism, then I was concerned that they did that. And even the former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg protested that, and I thought it was good that we've got a number of people on both sides saying that was not the right reaction to what's happening right now in Israel.
Well, Ted Cruz called it an economic boycott of Israel because, of course, their big industry is tourism, and it's summertime. And this is one Hamas launch rocket that landed in a field a mile from the airport. That was the reason for closing the airport. It's been reopened now.
Right.
There's a lot of international pressure on them for that. And but, I think at first I thought I didn't know if that critique of that closing of the airport was right because, they're erring on the side of security and safety, which Israel is big on all of that. But that is the most secure airport in the world. And they have lots of measures in place. And so as the news began to play out on that, I do think it was a little bit overkill to close the airport.
What about the media coverage? Any comments from either of you about the way this has been covered? Because it certainly seems to me, and we've talked about this with some of our other guests in previous weeks, that whether it's CNN or BBC, they talk a great deal about casualties in Hamas and in the Gaza Strip, and we understand that that's taking place. But if you don't give any context to that for people that aren't real high information viewers and listeners, the typical low information voter probably thinks, well, this is Goliath beating up on David.
Absolutely. I actually think the media coverage in this particular battle has been better than in the past. You often do hear media people saying things like, Israel is attacking the Palestinians, and you say, no, they are fighting back against Hamas. But I do detect a slight shift in the media's coverage of all this, because I think that the Israelis have been very effective. Netanyahu has been very effective with his comments about, we have rockets coming in to civilian areas, to hospitals, to schools, and talking about living under that. I think he's been really articulate this time, and I think more sympathy is going to Israel, thinking, what is it? What would you do if you were living this way? Anyone would have to fight. And I also think Prime Minister Netanyahu has been really articulate about the idea that we don't want to go after the Palestinians. We drop flyers, we warn them, we encourage them to try to leave. But, when you have your enemy, Hamas, hiding in the midst, what is it you could do? And I actually think he's making some headway in world opinion on that. He certainly may have turned the majority, but my sense is there's more sympathy for Israel's conduct this time.
Yes.
Well, I suppose it depends on, how deeply you're looking at it. I think that people that are those low information voters or whatever, who are just scratching the surface, are still hearing this whole moral equivalence between Palestine and Israel. They just don't get it. But whatever Israel does to defend itself is bad. And then, they warn the Palestinian civilians. A lot of times, because these people are taught by jihadists, they run toward the area that they're warned away from, because they're willing to sacrifice themselves or act as human shields. And that's what happens. Of course, we had this UN center that was also a school bombed yesterday, but they were warned. And a lot of these places are, they may be a house or a school, but they've got rockets in there. So go ahead,
Yeah,
Debbie.
I was going to say, Israel did acknowledge, I think they did acknowledge that it may have been our rockets that hit that UN center, but but there were rockets coming at us from there. So I don't know. I could be wrong, and maybe the low information voters still have a long way to go. But I think there's some sense. What would you do? And I was going to mention we have family friends who live in Israel, and this good friend who lives in Tel Aviv was telling my husband yesterday, when you hear the sirens go off, warning rockets are coming, how long you have before the rocket hits? 15 seconds. So he's talking about, how do you have a family life? How do you go to the park? You can't do anything because you have 15 seconds to grab your kids and get someplace safe. So they're living in a way that none of us would ever agree to live. We would fight back in every way we could.
Yeah, and that's what I think we should do. I do not think that our State Department and John Kerry should agree to a ceasefire right now. I think we should let Israel play this out, destroy as much of the rockets as possible. And these tunnels, they have built an extremely sophisticated network of tunnels that can kidnap Israelis in those tunnels and take them back in. They can bring people out to cause all kinds of damage. And the tunnels need to be destroyed. This is it. It's a weapon that they're using.
It most certainly is, and actually there is a great weapon to fight against tunnels like that. They call them bunker busters, and Israel has a small number of those, and they've been using them. And when I say small number, in comparison to the supply America has on hand, and one thing you can, if you were interested, let your congressman know, I want you to supply Israel bunker busters, not just for this war, but to end the ability of enemies of Israel, Hamas and others, to access and get into Israel through these tunnels, just for all future time. Take them out.
Yeah, because I think it's one of their solutions. Israel has this iron dome that protects against the rockets coming in, and it has actually stopped about 90% of the rockets coming in. And so that's why we don't hear about the casualties in Israel, but they've built that at great expense.
You put on the table something that we have, one of our articles here, Senator Lindsey Graham, no ceasefire until Israel neutralizes Hamas. And back to the point I made just a minute ago, if you're kind of a student of history, and you can look at 1967, 1973, you can look at the Six-Day War, you can look at all sorts of different, the Yom Kippur War and things like that, most of those were closed down pretty quickly. There were sanctions, there were other countries trying to prevent that. We're in the 18th, now going on the 19th day of this ongoing military action, which almost is unprecedented. And I think it's partially because there are those that are surrounding the nation of Israel that recognize if they don't neutralize Hamas, it's not just a problem for Israel. It can be a problem elsewhere. And the radicals are taking over in certain countries, and that does not spell a positive scenario for anybody that's more of a moderate Muslim, anybody that sort of made their peace with the modern world.
Absolutely. I love the idea of having people within Islam who have some respect in various Muslim communities be the ones starting to speak more actively against the radicals. Because if it's just America or just Christians, it doesn't have the same influence. I love that thought, and I hope it's true. I did, and I love what Lindsey Graham said, no ceasefire until Israel neutralizes Hamas. But there was also a statement out just yesterday from Hezbollah saying, despite the Syrian rift, Hezbollah pledges full support to Hamas. So they're not on the same side in Syria, but they are also telling Hamas, we're with you. So this is unfortunately, a long, drawn-out war, and I do think that what Israel is doing is vital. I completely agree with Penna. We need to let them actually do everything they can to disarm and get all the rockets that Hamas has out of Gaza to have a possible path toward peace.
I love your comment about 15 seconds. I don't know if you've seen the YouTube video, but they got a picture of people running in the Olympics and how far they can run in 15 seconds, and then say basically nobody in Israel really is truly safe. And if it weren't for the Iron Dome, we'd have massive casualties in Israel right now.
Yeah, it was interesting. I learned a lot today from this piece in the Wall Street Journal by the former head of the Marine Corps, Conway. And he said that, well, of course, first of all, he made the point that the military exists to protect its civilian populations and tries to avoid the citizen casualties. Palestinian fighters and Hamas, they use the civilians as shields, and they deliberately target the Israeli citizens. So there's the difference right there also. And then he talked about how Israel is providing Gaza with food.
Yes.
4,400 tons the first week of this conflict. Also natural gas, diesel fuel, and even electricity was disrupted by the Hamas rockets, but the Israelis went and built the lines back so that they could still have electricity. Doesn't
strike you as somebody that is trying to engage in genocide. And that piece that we ran last week by Joshua Goldberg, I think just illustrates that this is, these comments about genocide in Israel and things like that, they are actually showing as much compassion to the people as possible, but they want to take out the militants that are causing such havoc.
There's been a lot of talk also, infrequently every time there's a conflict, about the sympathy toward the Palestinian people, that they are just a lost people, they have no homeland, and they need to have their own homeland, and all that kind of talk. Which is true, and there are certainly innocent people in every war. There are innocent civilians in every war there's ever been. But they do have, their leader, Abbas, has locked arms with Hamas. So you can't really say, I want the people, of course, I want all innocent people to be safe, to be free of being hit by a rocket. But when your leader locks arms with Hamas, what is it what should Israel do and Hamas is a sworn enemy of Israel. And I don't know, we're on time, but there was also a comment by the Iranian, one of the leaders of the, I guess he's supreme ruler in Iran, saying that the only solution to Gaza is a complete destruction of Israel. So even the Iranians are still mouthing that.
That's just amazing. Well, we have a lot of turmoil in the Middle East, and when we come back, we'll also talk about some of the turmoil still on our southern border. Lots to cover, and we will do so right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna, Dexter, Debbie Georgatos with us. And we certainly do welcome your phone calls. We've talked already about the Middle East. We've talked about Israel. I would like to spend some time talking about immigration. We're going to move on to some other topics. There are so many things to talk about. And Penna, you've been around here for a few years, and you remember in the old days, not so long ago in July, that sometimes when Marlon Maddox was around or when you and I would host the program, they'd say in July, why don't we run a few tapes? It's it's really slow. There's, Congress is not in session. The Supreme Court's not in session. Nothing's really happening. This is the busiest July and now entering into August that I can ever remember. And you've been around a few years like I have. So we were going to try to cover as many things as we can. And if you'd like to join us, we would love to get your comments. One of the articles we've posted here, which I thought was very interesting and I found very helpful, is called Impressions from the Border. Teresa Mull wrote it at Human Events. And not only do you have some very good perspective, you've also got some pictures that you might want to look at. But Penna, as I read that, it reminded me again that, okay, we've made some progress in terms of border security, but we still have a long way to go, don't we?
We do, and things that you don't hear about that she mentioned is that there are actually a lot of injuries to the Border Patrol agents that are trying to protect the border down there. That there's a special operations group that's designed to respond to all this. They're equipped with a fleet of helicopters to believe it or not, rescue stranded immigrants. So we're rescuing these people.
Yes, we are.
And then there are rescue towers throughout the desert so illegals and smugglers can call for help in case of emergency. And today's news, I mean, to me, this is absolutely unbelievable. This is not in this article, but the administration now is talking with Honduras, which is where a lot of these people are coming from, these kids, about screening them in Honduras to decide if they merit refugee status to come to the United States. And, I don't know, there's been speculation that we'll actually fly them up here. So, you just, in a sense, you don't know what to think. Now, I do know that our governor from Texas is now sending National Guard down there. And there's, on both people on both sides of this, some say the Border Patrol will actually be hamstrung by having the National Guard there. I find that hard to believe. Yes, you may have to absorb a few extra people, but extra people mean extra security and stopping the people from going down. I do also hear that we have fewer people coming than we did a few weeks ago.
That's true.
And that's because we're aware of this now. And, as many people as possible are trying to send messages down to Central America that we are not, we're not paradise for you to send your kids up here.
I would think one message that would be easy to send is to have a busload of kids that were up here deported back to Honduras rather than being in Honduras and say, look, we're just going to save you the long walk through Mexico or the train ride on the NAFTA train. Kathy Adams did a very good job talking about that NAFTA train that is really being used right now to shuttle them up there. But again, we've got some major issues. And I was going to ask you a question just a minute ago about the governor, but before we get to that, Debbie, your reflections on some of the impressions that Teresa Mull has from the border. I was really enlightened a little bit more and kind of shocked at all the things we do when we're at the border right now as a hospitable country towards those that are trying to sneak in illegally.
I learned a lot from the article, too, and really appreciated it. One point Penna didn't get to in here that was interesting was how many of the immigrants that they referred to as the smugglers who know the system, they immediately demand rights and amenities as soon as they're arrested. And so we have a system, we have a country where we've done a beautiful job developing rights and refining them, but they're being relied on by people who are sneaking in, which somehow seems to be turned on its head. As the Honduran proposal, two things were really troubling about it. One was that the administration, the Obama administration, has said they believe they may be within their rights as administration to simply set this up in Honduras, set up the whole immigration screening in Honduras via executive order, that there's no need for Congress to act, so they don't really care if Congress agrees. But the second point was I was realizing that, if you try to step back, if there really were a genuine crisis occurring in some country, apparently we do. We have people who come here as refugees. And so, to me, what is so problematic about Honduras, it just reflects on the total breakdown of trust in American politics. I don't trust the current administration to apply standards of law when they go down and set up immigration processing in Honduras. Because they haven't shown respect for the law in enforcing the border and in literally dozens of other ways. So it is the idea that they're going to, without congressional oversight, send somebody down, decide who's eligible, and the numbers they estimated were that they thought may come in as a result of this kind of didn't seem realistic. They were talking about, of the people who've come here so far, there have been 16,500 unaccompanied children coming to the U.S. just from Honduras, But this entire proposal of them going down to Honduras and screening people said that estimate at the most 5,000 would apply. So 1/3 estimate would apply and only 1,750 would be accepted. This is when you could literally get in a bus or walk to the Capitol and have your interview. So the numbers they're speculating on are absurdly low.
Yeah, I would think so. Penna, any comments?
Well, I will just say that immigration reform died because of this crisis at the border.
Right.
We already were not inclined to trust this administration with immigration reform, and that just, that put the icing on the cake. Now, as they talk about this whole plan to bring these young people in from Honduras, and they say it's because they've got to get out of there because it's so violent and there's gang violence. And, I just start to worry about gang members being exported up here also. Sure. I mean, how do we really stop that? How do we really tell? I know there would be some sort of screening, but it's really just they're trying to get more voters for a certain party, for a certain position, for a certain type of state that we need to have that's a more progressive, liberal welfare state. That's what they're trying to get. It's one of their methodologies that they're using. And, we see through all of that. It's just almost impossible to do anything about it unless we can rein in this president who doesn't seem to have any respect for congressional action, but takes his own actions.
Looks like Congress is going to head back to their home states without doing anything on this, and it's understandable because the Democrats want to spend. They have a bill for $2.7 billion. The president had even more than that, but we'll use the Democratic bill, $2.7 billion, but very little, if any, of that was going to border security. You have the Republican proposal, which was a number of common sense proposals for border security. And Debbie, I just get the feeling that pretty soon all these members of Congress are going to head home to their home districts. Maybe they'll hear from the people there, but they'll have nothing to show for it, right?
Absolutely. I think there are many Congress members are planning on town halls. And if ever there was a time people are worked up about an issue, this immigration, this essentially borderless southern border of America and this invasion of, it's not just children too. I think the media depicts this as a children crisis because then we say, well, gosh, children, and we do feel compassionate. But it's not just children, it's teenagers and young adults and families and people who we do not know whether they mean America harm or not. And it's also really a crisis, honestly, for Christians because to the extent that these are genuinely innocent children who may not have had any involvement in the decision to get over the border. They were just told by that. How do we handle them as a people, as a loving people, but on the other hand, try to insist on a secure border and actual immigration laws that we enforce, that we revise if we need to, enforce and follow?
Yeah, and again, there's been some things written about that. As a matter of fact, Russell Moore is the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. Richard Land used to be there, has been speaking on that. Ronnie Floyd, who's the current president of the Southern Baptist Convention, actually speaking in my church this Sunday. And I think we, on the one hand, do provide compassion, but we don't forget the other part of that equation, and that is the Constitution and our convictions about the fact that if you have a state or a country that does not have borders, you don't have a country anymore. And we
Amen.
Right now have pretty much an open border, do we not?
Yeah, I love Russ Moore. And he went down to the border, and he's looking at this. And, the first principle for this that you look at is Romans 13:1.
Right.
Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So we've got laws and we've got rules, and that really has to be the bottom line, the beginning of this argument. And then you start talking about compassion. But you have to obey the rules or the laws, or again, we are a nation of laws and of rules and of a constitution, and we have to begin there.
Well, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we might take some of your phone calls, but also going to move on to one more issue, as if we didn't have so many issues on the table. But Penna Dexter, if you are listening online, you can hear her commentary right now on the LGBT executive order. And over the last couple of days, we've been talking about some of the concerns that we have right now, in which you have 19 states that have same-sex marriage, 28 that have responded with constitutional amendments to define marriage. You have the other 3 states. Then you get up to 31 that actually say that marriage is between one man and one woman. Well, in the midst of this, the president has an executive order. In the midst of this, you have now a number of states passing these so-called transgender bathroom bills, and we're going to talk about that and have an action item for you on our website today. So for those of you that have an opportunity, you might turn on your computer, because you'll hear Penna's commentary that even if you don't, you have an opportunity by going to our blog to read it today. We'll talk about that, and we'll also take your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Under the banner of curtailing workplace discrimination against homosexuals, lesbians, and transgendered people, President Obama has issued an executive order that concerns all federal contractors and subcontractors. The order states that all companies that do business with the federal government and companies who help them complete that work will have to put aside religious and other principles with regard to the employment of people who practice open homosexual and transgendered behavior. This will go into effect next year. There is no exemption for religiously affiliated contractors, other than a very limited protection put in place during the Bush administration. Businesses will be able to consider sexual orientation and behavior and to hire, promote, and fire anyone they like in ministerial positions. For non-religious posts, contractors can consider religion in hiring practices, but not sexual orientation or gender identity. Immediately following the White House announcement of this executive order, the Family Research Council's Peter Spriggs stated, "This level of coercion is nothing less than viewpoint blackmail that bullies into silence every contractor and subcontractor who has moral objections to homosexual behavior." He continued, "People with deeply held convictions regarding the morality of certain types of behavior should not be bound by the dictates of President Obama's agenda." The left has been trying to pass a bill with the Orwellian title, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, ENDA, for 2 decades. They haven't succeeded. But this order ignores Congress and goes a long way toward enacting ENDA by presidential fiat. After the decision in the Hobby Lobby case, it's clear the Supreme Court, albeit narrowly, will still protect the religious liberty of employers. This did not stop this administration from forcing companies with religious owners to disregard their convictions about the morality of certain types of behavior. A senior administration official noted that the Hobby Lobby decision did not involve federal contracts, saying, "We were comfortable moving forward with this executive order in light of Hobby Lobby." In other words, since the Hobby Lobby decision protected the religious liberties of a narrow subset of companies, the White House was determined to force this agenda on another big chunk of employers, federal contractors. Folks, it's becoming clearer by the week. Christians with their biblical morality and bothersome tendency to insist on adhering to it in all aspects of their lives are simply in the left's way as it tries to make sweeping changes. The secular left wants no accommodation for the religious views of ordinary Americans. This particular executive action is another example of the left's bullying of Christians, trying to force their worldview out of the workplace and the culture and confine it to the pews. So what do? Matt Barber, law professor and cultural commentator, wrote at WND.com, "For 2,000 years, whenever such conflicts have arisen, Christians have placed the laws of God above the laws of men. The question is, will Christians stand? We must." For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Debbie Georgatos, and one of our roundtable guests last week was Dylan McCabe, and he's on the line. So, Dylan, what do you want to share with our people today?
Well, here's my issue, and this may sound a little crass, but I'm confused, and I think we've overcomplicated the issue with the whole border control situation. Number one, when did the vast exodus taking place from Mexico become our problem? And I know that sounds crass, but why are we spending tons of money? And I heard either Penna or Debbie mention even flying over there and flying people to this country and so on and so forth. So that's my big confusion. Number one, why is Mexico's problem all of a sudden becoming something the U.S. is taking care of? And then number two, something that seems to be totally overlooked or not mentioned in the media is the fact that we have a legal immigration process, and it's good, but it's not being utilized and it's not being maintained at all. And that seems to be something that's just absent from the dialogue.
Certainly. Debbie?
I wanted to pick up one thing Penna said, and in response to Dylan, is Penna mentioned earlier how the people coming in here are viewed by many on the left as being likely voters for their party. And that really is, to answer most questions about immigration, If the Democrats in Washington thought that most new of these border crossers would be strong conservative Republican voters, they'd be building the fence. This is truly very crassly political calculation by their side. And another related to that is people coming over the border who've come from countries that don't have a system like America. Part of what they will do, in addition to vote for big government and handouts, they don't know what America is, the kind of really deep, important ideas in the founding of America. And so when the left wants to transform America, this helps them, bringing people in who don't know what America is, who don't grasp at a deep level what the Declaration and the Constitution meant. This helps the leftist shift of transformation away from what America is supposed to be.
I think, Jillian, you asked when did the problems of these countries become ours? And I think when you look at the opinion polls right now, they are trending to be in opposition of these people coming. And people in the American public would like to see us figure out ways to either block it, send these people back, or whatever. It's just that our laws right now, the way they exist, we've got this sex trafficking law that passed in 2008 that needs to be amended in some ways. I know that certain groups are against doing that because now it's really making it impossible to send kids back. They have to stay here and go through a process. And so, it becomes our problem because the way our laws are written.
One of the things we did last week, and we still have that available if you want to go to our Take Action section, but we've put it now as a secondary one, was a way in which you can contact your two senators and your representative on the two issues we've talked about: secure the border and amend this law to expedite deportation. So I would assume most of you have done that. If you have not, go to our website, Take Action, and you'll find that it's the lead one there. But on the front, we're going to talk for just a few minutes about what has been unfolding in terms of the gay agenda. Penna Dexter's commentary, which you can find in a couple of ways. You can go either today on Point of View, and under her picture you'll have the link, or if you go to the Point of View blog on the right-hand corner, you can read what she's written about the LGBT executive order. Penna, if you can, explain what the president has done.
He announced it last Monday, and really what this is it's a decree from on high that enacts ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Kerby, you and I have talked about it for 20 years. It's been a bill that Congress has tried to pass. It's passed various houses, but never both houses, never become law. It's got an Orwellian name, but really what it does is it builds up a special status for people who are homosexual, gay, lesbian, and transgender, and all of the other deviancies. And it gives the employers, people who have certain ideas about homosexuality, perhaps do not want to employ someone who's an open homosexual or transgender. Maybe they have a restaurant, they've got people serving the public, they have a certain image they want to portray, and they are losing all rights with this executive order if they deal with a federal contractor. If they are a federal contractor, if they deal with the federal government. Wow. Any company that's a federal contractor is subject to this law where they have no rights to let their opinion about homosexuality influence their hiring practices. This is another tool to destroy religious liberty in the country, and the Congress would never pass it the way it exists now. But President Obama has taken it upon himself to basically, as a tyrant, as a king, to decree that this will be the law, and it will begin next year.
I might just mention that we sent out to those of you that already receive our Outlook magazine a series of articles on the transgender issue called Blurred Lines. Also, my appeal letter to you is probably arriving right now. And in that, Penna, we talked about the fact that, we talk about LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. Well, actually, it goes on. There's Q's in there and all sorts of other things. Facebook now has 51 choices for gender, and then they ask other people to suggest it. Last time I counted, I think it's up to 58, So we're talking about activists pursuing things and coming up with some of the most bizarre ideas. And if you're an employer and you're thinking, I want people to wear a uniform, oftentimes they say, do I want individuals that have a lot of piercing or tattoos, or, we're trying to project an image, and the individual comes, a man dresses, as a woman or anything like that. this order, as I understand it, pretty much says there's nothing you can do about it if you're a federal contractor.
And really what it does is open up the possibility for all sorts of lawsuits by employees of their employers and claiming all sorts of persecution and discrimination against them because of their sexual orientation. I mean, really, when you hire someone, you don't normally ask them what their sexual orientation is. So they could then come back and say, okay, I was not promoted because I'm a lesbian. And, perhaps the employer didn't even know this person was a lesbian. So that's the mild part of it. But I think that the real violation of religious liberty is the fact that, and this applies even to nonprofits that may be religious.
Right.
Churches are exempt. That's about it. The exemption is very, very, very small. And so, if you're a religious organization, you do some sort of ministry. Maybe you're a Christian bookstore. Maybe you are a college that teaches Christian. I mean, these people are losing their rights if they contract with the federal government.
And just to illustrate this again, Hobby Lobby, look at how close that decision was. Right. And it sort of narrowly said, okay, we maybe can extend the exemption, and Hobby Lobby had to do with Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. But it shows that there is still a lot of people that are saying corporations are not people. If you make a profit, you lose your religious liberty, and on and on. So we recognize that even though this so-called de facto and executive order, quote, does exempt churches, realistically, it's only churches that are houses of worship. Anything else that's sort of even Christian is under this as well, is it not?
And I might mention that most of the Fortune 500 companies already have broad non-discrimination policies. They are already complying with this order anyway. And, that's sort of the trend that's been happening lately in the country anyway. So really what this is just another way for this administration to hamstring Christians. Christianity, people of faith are in the way of the left's agenda. So they are trying to wipe that out, to remove that possibility that you could live according to your faith and take your worship of God outside of the pews.
Well, one of the things we put on the website there is for you to respond. Obviously, we believe that the key to this is education, which is what we've been doing here today. And certainly if you believe in this and are certainly moved by some of the things that are either in my letter, my email, or in the 2 Outlook articles written by Warren Kelly and others, we certainly do encourage you to go to that website, pointofview.net, click on that button there, Blurred Lines, and help us out. Debbie?
And it's just a brilliant, wonderful commentary you wrote. I liked it very much.
Very well written.
Yeah, I appreciate it very much. And I know that these facts I'm about to state are not dispositive of the issue, but I do think sometimes it's interesting to note the left has pushed so hard on the LGBT agenda, but the CDC, which has no agenda other than gathering data, they had data out this year, July of this year. In a massive survey they did, only 1.6% of Americans identify as gay or lesbian. 1.6, under 2%. But an interesting thing was the survey then asked people how many Americans do you think are gay or lesbian? And it was 25%.
25%. Yeah, I saw that just the other day in the survey. I think Tony Perkins mentioned that as well. So obviously that's important, and especially when we talk about transgender, it's got to be a fraction of that 1.7%. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll take some more phone calls, but I have 2 very smart women. We're going to talk also about this war on women when we come back.
Across the nation, this is Point of View. For materials offered during the broadcast, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, it's our weekend edition. If you'd like to join our conversation, you certainly had a chance to hear from us. We'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. If you're just joining us in the first hour, we spent some time talking about the Middle East. We talked about Israel. We've talked about immigration. We've talked about this LGBT executive order. We have much more to cover, but I wanted to back out of the news cycle for a minute to look at a broader theme, something that's not necessarily a news story any one day, but it has been a series of news stories, and that is the issue of the war on women. I am starting to see, Penna, Dexter, and Debbie Georgatos, that we're looking at a governor's race in Texas. We're looking at a senatorial race in Colorado. More recently, the governor's race in Virginia a while back. This is where this war on women theme that surfaced in the last presidential election is now showing up again. So I guess a couple of questions. What is there a war on women? But more importantly, why is the Democratic Party in particular, a lot of these Democratic Party candidates going back to a theme that was used in 2012. They're now using it again in 2014.
I guess they think it works. And, I think it restarted after the Hobby Lobby decision. The Hobby Lobby decision was certainly good for conservatives, for Christians, for people of faith. But it also brought the left back into line on this issue of contraception. And the government, and it's not that you cannot get contraception, which is what they would like to portray. Yes. They would like to say the conservatives and Christians want to deny women their contraception, and that is why there's a war on women. No one's denying anyone any contraception. It's a matter of 20 different methods of contraception, and under the Hobby Lobby decision, 4 of them do not have to be paid for by health insurance policies under Obamacare, because they can work by causing an abortion, and people object to that. So it's amazing to me. It's amazing, but it works, and that's why you asked why they brought it back. Yeah. Because it gathers in single women, not all of them certainly, but it gathers in enough single women who they tend to vote very liberal, very Democrat. They tend to be poorer and more dependent on the government, or just simply more liberal, even if they're successful. And they have this idea that the government should be providing this. And so they draw in a lot of numbers, a lot of votes through this rhetoric, even though it's not true.
Yeah, it's amazing, because 16 out of 20 are actually funded even by Hobby Lobby.
That's right.
And so you can't make the case that they are denying contraceptives. But Debbie, you've been in Colorado. I've seen some of the ads. And that is exactly what Senator Udall is saying about his opponent right now. I'm just picking him as an example. I mean, there are dozens of examples all over the country. But I'll just pick Colorado for a minute, since I know you were just there, and saying that he is denying you women contraception. Now, it seems to me at its face that's wrong, but somehow they're still using that as a way to win elections.
They certainly are. On a broad point about the war on women, I think most of what has happened in America under President Obama, really since 2009, things are not going well. The economy is terrible, and despite the effort to put out false numbers, the economy is terrible. Jobs are terrible. The border is a mess. There is no border security. There's just a host of failures on the part of the Obama administration, and no one likes Obamacare. So I think they're trying to just turn their people's attention away from reality to a false scenario of just a false picture. And this war on women idea, it stirs up, and I don't mean to sound harsh, but it stirs up ignorant voters, people who don't force people to go beyond rhetoric and say, what do you mean by that? What are the points you're saying, and how is the other side different? So I do think it's being used to emotionally manipulate women, and I think women should find that offensive. In Colorado in particular, yes, there's a lot of discussion about how unless you support abortion and late-term abortion and every other thing that the left wants, you're engaged in a war on women, and we have to challenge that as a party. There are actually a lot of great arguments being made by different groups in America on who's really engaged in a war on women, whose policies really help women, and whose don't.
It's demeaning to women. And this one activist, I think you might have met her when you were in Colorado, or at least heard about her, Debbie. But she said, she's asking this question, do they think that I only care about birth control? Do they think that's the only issue that I vote on?
Is this the highest priority? You seem to be easy to set that aside. I mean, even if you were against contraception, and none of these candidates that I know of are, but even if you were, could you say, is this the highest priority right now when the world is aflame? We have conflict in the Middle East. We have overrunning our borders. We are running $17 trillion in debt. This is the big issue. But Debbie, talk a little bit more about that activist there.
Yes, her name is Laura Caro in Colorado, and she is a fireball. She created a group called I Am Created Equal, and she actually made a commercial, shot it in her own home, and got it up in the air. And she closes the commercial with this line: "Do you honestly think we need the government to help to make these choices for us?" And she's basically making the pitch: women don't care just about birth control, and she uses the expression, we're much more complicated than that. We care about a lot of things. And she brings up that the left, if all you have to offer us is birth control and abortion, you're not speaking to my needs. She's very eloquent. She's kind of a fireball. She created a big event up there in the Western Slope and got a lot of people. And she's just a fireball and just saying you have to answer to the big issues in America, not just this.
There's a blogger named Terry O'Brien, and she was talking about the Hobby Lobby case, and she says, the owners of Hobby Lobby have a tough time understanding how they have zero say in a woman's choice about what she does with her body, but 100% responsibility to pay for whatever choice she makes.
Yeah.
That's what they're asking for.
I have a commentary coming out next week, and it was based upon Dr. Ben Carson, who was saying, let's look at this issue that surfaced out of the Hobby Lobby case. And Penna, you've written quite a bit about this, and that is, on the one hand, the supporters of the Hobby Lobby decision said employers should not be forced to fund something for which they have a moral objection. And on the other hand, critics say employers should not be able to tell you what you can and cannot use. And I love Dr. Ben Carson. He says, in a sense, I agree with both of them. Your employer shouldn't be telling you what to do. You should be able to have your own health savings account. You should be able to spend your own money, and that way you would not be forced to actually fund something that you had religious objections to. And I thought that was genius, because basically saying, I agree with my liberal friends and I agree with my conservative friends. I agree with the people that were against the Hobby Lobby decision and those who were for it, because the answer to all of that is to defund Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and let everybody have their own health savings account and let them make their own decisions.
Let them figure it out. It's interesting. After Hobby Lobby, of course, Congress came back, some senators came back and said, we're going to overturn this with legislation. And guess who one of the co-sponsors was? It was Patty Murray from Washington, Senator, and Mark Udall from Colorado. Right. They introduced the bill. It didn't go anywhere, but they're still going to be pushing it before the next election.
A quick point on the Hobby Lobby case. We mentioned so often in our conversations here about how the left is just ardent in its messaging and pushes messages. And so you try to create the impression that the Hobby Lobby decision just was overwhelmingly unpopular and America didn't like it. But actually, a very large poll pointed out Americans agree with the Hobby Lobby decision 49 to 38%. So we need to be comfortable to say, we're not defending an unpopular thing. We're speaking for how most Americans see things.
I would think so. Let's take a break. Let's take some phone calls. If you'd like to join us, we've put one more issue on the table, the war on women, as we've also talked about Israel, immigration, and, of course, many of these other topics like the LGBT executive order. So let's give you a chance to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Some of the articles we've been referring to are in our articles section, as well as the blog post is one today by Penna Dexter. You can find those there, but give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
We have a problem when it comes to understanding the numbers we use when talking about trillions of dollars in government spending and our national debt. Most of us have no mental category for the word trillion. When I talk about it, I try to explain how big the number is by saying that a trillion is 1,000 billion. I don't know if that helps, but here are some other ideas. A few years ago, Jeremy Harper made news when he counted to 1 million in front of a webcam. He took some sleep breaks, so it took him 89 days. But a million is really a very small number. 1 trillion is actually 1 million million. If someone wanted to count to a trillion, counting one number per second and taking no breaks, it would take him 32,000 years. Here's another example. America has not even been around a trillion seconds. As a matter of fact, Western civilization has not been around a trillion seconds. For that matter, all of recorded history is less than a trillion seconds. To understand trillion, you probably need to use examples from astronomy. How long would it take to travel 1 trillion miles? Even traveling at the speed of light, it would take 2 months. However, if you took 1 trillion $1 bills and laid them end to end, they would reach from the Earth to the Sun. And while we're using astronomical illustrations, let's consider our own galaxy. Our solar system is just an incredibly small part of the Milky Way galaxy. Some estimate that our galaxy has about 100 billion stars, although some say even more. But if we use the number 100 billion, we would need 10 galaxies like the Milky Way to equal 1 trillion stars. I think you get the point. We've lost track of how big these numbers are, and it's worth remembering the next time you hear that the federal budget is $3.5 trillion and the national debt is over $17 trillion. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. It is our weekend edition. Penna, Dexter, and Debbie Georgatos. And your book is one that we are featuring today, which we do from time to time. Ladies, Can We Talk? America Needs Our Vote. And while we're talking about this war on women, maybe we could just talk for just a minute about how you talk to women and educate them about that issue, because these women are going to be very important in this next election. We talk about soccer moms. We talk about middle-aged moms. Men and women both have a stake in the next election, but sometimes the women are the ones that will determine who is actually elected in some of these congressional races.
Absolutely right. Women are the majority of voters in virtually every election in America. Not only do women outnumber men, but we tend to vote in higher numbers every single age. So it's important for everyone to be involved politically, to kind of think through, not just emotionally, how do I feel about some issue, but what's the outcome going to be if we keep voting for bigger government? What's the outcome going to be in the economy if we keep growing the social programs, the dependency creating programs, and every issue, thinking in bigger ways. Part of what I tried to say in the book over and over was conservative policies are better for women. They lift women and everybody else up. Republican policies are better for women and for everyone. And I also encourage in my talks around the country the idea of just embracing what America's all about. How do we get here as being the most prosperous nation? Hold on to those ideas and speak up about them in your daily life.
Let's talk about the difference, because women are different, as men are too. There's a difference between married women and women that are single. There's probably a difference between African-American women and Anglo-American women, for example. And you've actually looked at some of those differences because it sometimes is a predictor on how they're going to vote in a particular election.
It sure is. Unmarried women, not just young women who are just out of college and on their own, but unmarried women, whether they are widowed or divorced, tend to overwhelmingly vote for Democrat politicians. They vote for bigger government and Democrat or big government ideas, and it's mainly out of a sense of economic vulnerability, just a concern if I can't support myself, I kind of like there being a really big safety net. And I can understand that kind of on a personal fear level, but again, I encourage people to think about what is it we are creating in a country where we have, for example, now we have such a large number of people dependent on the government and fewer people working and paying taxes. Where is that going to take us if we're just continually growing that state of people, at that pool of people living off of government? The great expression by our former Senator Phil Gramm about we have too many people sitting in the cart and too few pulling. That's kind of where we are. So voting for social safety net and big government isn't necessarily going to make you more secure, especially in a country where we have $17 trillion in debt. We can't afford the policies we do have. And so it's interesting also because I think people tend to assume that unmarried women vote based on the social issues, but that's not really their primary motivation. Mostly it's economic security. And I really urge people to think about economic security comes from a stable economy. It comes from a more balanced sense in government where we're not spending more than we're taking in. It comes from holding on to the free market system. That's what makes economic stability.
I know that they don't necessarily vote single issue on social issues, but I think the social issues contribute to women's positions that causes them to vote for more government benefits. Because when you look at, for instance, this contraceptive mandate, this is assuming that women are sexually active outside of marriage. It's assuming that. It's not giving people any credit who are young single women who are saving themselves for marriage is not even, that is just so far off the radar screen of politicians now, they don't even think about it. And so it assumes this kind of culture with free sexuality that that's just what you do on Saturday night. And so many of these women will find themselves with a child and very, very vulnerable economically and needing to have all kinds of government services to help them survive, and voting for this. And so the two work together hand in hand. And when you begin to break down the moral fiber of the nation, it wasn't that many decades ago when it was a little bit scandalous to think that women were sleeping with people outside of marriage, and that they weren't proud of it if they were. It's so different now. It is just so different, and that has been the left coming in, and that's one way that the left increases dependency on government is by breaking down the family and the moral fiber of our young women.
Penna, I could not agree more. The two social issues and fiscal issues are completely intertwined. And you're exactly right. The destruction of not just the destruction of the family, but the destruction of kind of basic moral standards in society and the growth of single-parent households, it makes it essential for the government to help because these women don't have a way to go. So, when you read these stories about women who are poor and have many children and you think, well, how are we going to help them? So the answer is, well, we have to have more programs. Deeper thinkers and more people committed to longer term goodness of America. We need to be not just talking about how do we help these people, but what do we do as a society so we don't have so many people in that situation again. I completely agree.
You just look at our college campuses, for instance, and just the way they're set up right now. Most of the dorms are co-ed. It feels like a young woman who really wants to remain abstinent barely has a chance to live her life that way because there are so many forces coming up against her. She doesn't really have the support. Hopefully her parents would support her, but I know a lot of parents who open up the home to, whatever goes on between their kids and their boyfriends and girlfriends. So, it's really sad. And some of us who are grown-ups, I think, need to grow up.
Let me pick up on something that both of you said, too, and that is, does the solution sometimes become a greater problem? And that is that in some of the Scandinavian countries, according to Stanley Kurtz, because you have such an extensive welfare system that was developed in large part so that if a woman did have a child out of wedlock, she would, in a sense, be supported by the state. You have declining rates of marriage, or if you want to look at the other way, increasing rates of cohabitation, or no cohabitation at all. I have a child. I don't even expect to have a father provide for me because I know that the welfare state provides for me. So in trying to address an issue, does not this policy increase that over time we're going to have fewer people getting married and fewer marriages and fewer births? And that spells, if nothing else, kind of a, if you will, kind of a demographic nightmare that's about ready to unfold, right?
Oh, absolutely true. You know, in America, you can look statistically and see a parallel between the growth of the welfare state, began in the 1960s with the Great Society, and the destruction of the nuclear family unit. They parallel each other, and it is, I'm sure people starting the Great Society didn't think, let's set out to destroy the American family. But this is where I go back to my many talks around the country. I say, facts matter. It doesn't matter if it was well-intentioned, the policies were there to help actual poor people. The reality is, this is the consequence, is we have broken down the family, and it isn't a moralistic pronouncement necessarily only, but it's just pragmatic. It's not good for children. It's not good for the children who grew up in homes with single parents. They're statistically just more likely to suffer all sorts of difficulties in life, from not finishing high school to becoming involved with drugs and becoming more likely to become involved in gangs, more likely to end up in jail. I mean, there's just statistically, it's just irrefutable that kids in single parent homes don't fare as well as in a nuclear family unit. So it's not just preachy, it's just what's good for kids even.
Yeah, we had Jason Riley on yesterday, and of course his book is entitled Please Stop Helping Us. He was obviously just talking about the African American community, but here we're on the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And he gives us all sorts of facts and figures of how much stronger African American families were before those were passed. And even in the 1960s, we pointed out that at that time, the Assistant Secretary of HEW, who later became the senior senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, was warning Lyndon Johnson then about the fact that the black family was in some kind of crisis. But now when you have just a disproportionate, more than 2/3 of all children in the African American community born outside of wedlock, that's not a prescription for prosperity. It's in most cases a ticket to poverty, and it's not easy to get back out of it.
I was in New York last week, and I had a driver that was talking about, he was black, and he was probably in his 60s, talking about his childhood and where mostly there were fathers in the home. And they really, they came down on their boys, and they made sure that they towed the line and behaved and studied in school. And how, he's got nieces now, he says, that both have kids that, there's no husband in the picture, and they're struggling. And, it was very refreshing to talk with someone like that, that's seen it. He's watched the disintegration of his community and, speaking against it.
Well, lots of things we put on the table here. When we come back, though, I did want to spend a little bit of time, but we mentioned the Hobby Lobby case, and there was a very important decision that came down this week that affects another aspect of Obamacare. This one has to do with the IRS and some of the other rules. So we saw, of course, how the Supreme Court ruled on the HHS mandate, but also we now have something about whether those subsidies can be provided in those 36 states that do not have a state exchange. And so some very important issues related to that. And I wanted to certainly cover that before we're done. Lots of issues on the table today. July usually was a time when it was quiet, but it is just one issue after the other. We still may not get all of them in. We'll try to get that electronic shoehorn to fit the last few in the last half hour, but you can join us if you'd like, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Might get to some of those phone calls in just a little bit, but let's, if we can, still go around the round table. Penna, Dexter, Debbie Georgatos, and I did want to talk a little bit about this ruling that came down from the federal courts. Actually, there were two, but I want to look at the one from the district court. This is tough to explain because sometimes it's like inside baseball. I don't want to get too technical, but the bottom line is for the Affordable Care Act, the law was written in such a way to say that you can provide subsidies through the state exchanges. Well, Penna, as you well know, and as many of our listeners know, most of the states said, we're not going to do this. That's just going to be too expensive. So we have 36 states, 36 states. Texas is a good example, and many other states, in which they do not have a state exchange. So people looking at the law says, well, then you cannot provide a subsidy to those states that don't have a state exchange. And a lot of people have tried to make a big deal about the fact that this was just a technicality in the law, or it was ambiguous. I don't think it was ambiguous at all. I think what was happening is President Obama, and at that time, Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and the Senate Majority Leader, Harry Reid, wanted to do all they could to force some of the costs onto the states so it wouldn't look so expensive. And so there was, with carrot and stick, trying to get all the states to have a state exchange. And one of those is you wouldn't get subsidies unless you have a state exchange. And I'll use Texas as a good example. Governor Rick Perry said, okay, we won't have a state exchange. And so, interestingly enough, the D.C. court, in a vote 2-1, said, that's right, you cannot provide subsidies. And to put that very simply, because I'm a simple man, this is like a stake in the heart of Obamacare if this ruling would stand.
It is, because we all know, and we've been talking for ever since January, about how expensive it is to buy your policy under Obamacare, or,
right.
You don't get much even for an expensive policy. So people who need it are getting subsidies right now. And it's interesting because I read today in the Wall Street Journal, Kim Strassel revealed this, that the IRS, because they're implementing this,
right,
they figure the subsidies. The IRS originally was going to follow the law, the letter of the law. They were not going to provide the subsidies for those who did not have a state exchange. And the Treasury Department got in the act and started pressuring the IRS. Rather than fight back, the IRS went ahead and wrote a rule that said that subsidies would go to all states, whether it was a state or federal exchange. So, some people have been looking at this. I've seen George Will writing about it a couple of times. I didn't know that it was percolating through the court system. But this week, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled on it. It was just the 3-judge panel of the D.C. Circuit, and said that's absolutely correct. They interpreted the law to say that it's only the states that have a state exchange that can provide subsidies for the people. Now, another circuit court, the Fourth Circuit, went the other way. Mm-hmm. So what is going to happen, we don't really know. Possibly they will go to the full en banc court in the D.C. Circuit. They may get a different ruling. It may reverse its 3-judge panel, because they packed that court with liberals.
Yeah, there's 11 in there, and when they go en banc, that means everybody gets to sit there. I'll let my law student here explain that in just a minute.
Yeah, she can explain that better than I can.
7 of those 11 were appointed either by Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, so it is possible that they may change that. But either way it goes, I think, Debbie, help us out here. This has to go to the Supreme Court, because you got 2 different rulings. You might have one that's appealed. I mean, sooner or later, this Supreme Court that originally looked like it might actually turn down and declare the Obamacare, Affordable Care Act unconstitutional until Justice Roberts changed his mind, is going to have to consider this case again, are they not?
I sure think they will. That is the very common way cases end up before the United States Supreme Court, is conflicting opinions from circuit courts. And so, yes, it sounds like, maybe they'll have an en banc hearing and go the other way, and then there won't be conflicting opinions, but is likely to end up there. What's really interesting about it is there has been a lot of criticism about courts kind of not following the law, but ruling how they want to rule, or finally getting to the result they want to get. And this was actually slightly refreshing to see a court say, we're actually going to read the law. It's plain black and white language. And as Penna alluded to, there was a motive to get it, or maybe you did, Kerby, allude to, there was a motive for the provisions that they put in. So now they're having to think through, they in Congress have to think through, well, that didn't work, and the court actually followed it. So it may end up back in Congress's hands ultimately, and then perhaps it's another chance for conservatives in Congress to either just move again for a complete repeal, which is what I support, or at least address this issue and perhaps win some other points in Obamacare and having to amend it based on what the Supreme Court finally says.
Listen, it doesn't work unless you have the subsidies, because health insurance, you're just going to get so many people dropping out of being insured if you don't have these subsidies. This guy he's the owner of the Dakota Voice in Rapid City, South Dakota. We know some people from there. It's a pretty conservative place.
Yes.
This is what he said about it, because they used this, as you said, Kerby, to pass Obamacare. They tried to get the cost down by shoving it off to the states. He says, we had a lawless Democrat Congress and a lawless president who sought to entice lawless states into betraying their people to an unconstitutional government health care system. He's not overstating it. With these federal subsidies, when they failed to be enticed, as many Republican leaders were and almost were, a lawless president just rewrote the law, decided to force that on the sovereign states, and now one court is upholding this lawless behavior. That's the Fourth Circuit that's upholding the behavior. It's going to be interesting. Another thing that could happen is someone could just go ahead and appeal the Fourth Circuit ruling directly to the Supreme Court and just leave the D.C. Circuit out.
Yeah.
Some people are advocating that.
Okay, I know that it is always dangerous to speculate, but as I pointed out just a minute ago, many people believe that actually 5-4, there was going to be a ruling from the Supreme Court that the Affordable Care Act was unconstitutional, and then Justice John Roberts changed his mind. Would he go along this time? And there have been some people sort of reading the tea leaves saying, wait a minute, he's actually agreed with a couple of rulings, one on the EPA that says you have to follow the letter of the law. You can't allow executive branch individuals like the IRS to make up rules. What a concept. But instead, you have to actually implement what was passed legislatively. So it would be, I think, even more difficult this time for John Roberts, since he has signed on opinions that have said that very thing, to then say, oh, but in this case, we're just going to allow the IRS to have total freedom to make up the rules as we go along. I mean, we've already sort of seen the president doing that with executive orders. It's harder to see how you end up with, again, a 5-4 decision in favor of the Affordable Care Act on this particular issue, which then, of course, punts it back to the Congress. So, Debbie, any thoughts about that? I'm just predicting. You don't have to agree with me, but just a thought.
Well, I generally think the Supreme Court, I mean, the conservatives in the court are pretty good about following the law and saying, and especially this is not a fuzzy area of interpretation. It's kind of a black and white. What does the law say? So I'd be a little more hopeful that Justice Roberts would be confident enough to stand up and agree that, yes, the way the law is written is how it has to be interpreted, and if that wasn't what Congress intended, it has to go back to them and let them fix it. I think he might do that, but I was actually among those completely shocked when he went along with what became the majority in the original litigation under Obamacare and upheld the constitutionality of individual mandate. I thought that was shocking.
You know, we have 7, as I mentioned, individuals on the D.C. court right now that were appointed either by President Obama, President Clinton. But again, will all 7 of those say, you know, even though it says that in the law, we're going to give the IRS the freedom to do so. So we'll see what the en banc court does as well, because you could make a case that at least 1 or 2, and only would take 2 of those people to say, you know, even though I really want the Affordable Care Act to be implemented, we really do have to follow the letter of the law. And if that's the case, then you'd have 2 precedents, one from the 2-1 vote, and then another one that could be 6-5 vote in both cases, or it could be even more so, 7-4, all sorts of things that you could possibly come up with. That would really then force the Supreme Court to take it almost immediately in October.
Let me ask Debbie, because how long will it take? I mean, they're getting these subsidies now. They haven't stopped the subsidies, so it's just flowing.
Yeah.
I don't know how to answer that. I wish I did, but I do not. But I was going to comment kind of a broader political thought about all this, which is, you know, President Obama's acting, and to use the expression Penna used earlier, kind of an imperial presidency. There's been a tendency in this administration to increasingly act outside of the area of law that the executive branch is supposed to do, executive orders that simply circumvent Congress, that are beyond the president's power. And there is actually more energy and conversation broadly in America about the idea that he's becoming dangerous, that it's past just simply a few decisions here and there, but simply the whole Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act has been implemented in a way that is circumventing the proper role of Congress. And in fact, there was testimony in Congress this week, I believe, by Michael Turley. I'm not sure.
Jonathan Turley.
Jonathan Turley, thank you. Yeah.
George Washington Law School.
Pointing this out. We just can't have I don't know if he used the term rogue president, but a president who doesn't follow the law. So my sense is maybe that thinking penetrates even the justices in these en banc, whether it goes en banc or the Supreme Court, that we've got to rein this in.
We're going to take a break. I'll take a phone call or two. But also, we're going to have Pat Buchanan on next week. He's got questions about impeachment. And we have some surveys about that. We'll talk about that and take some phone calls right after this.
Under the banner of curtailing workplace discrimination against homosexuals, lesbians, and transgendered people, President Obama has issued an executive order that concerns all federal contractors and subcontractors. The order states that all companies that do business with the federal government and companies who help them complete that work will have to put aside religious and other principles with regard to the employment of people who practice open homosexual and transgendered behavior. This will go into effect next year. There is no exemption for religiously affiliated contractors, other than a very limited protection put in place during the Bush administration. Businesses will be able to consider sexual orientation and behavior and to hire, promote, and fire anyone they like in ministerial positions. For non-religious posts, contractors can consider religion in hiring practices, but not sexual orientation or gender identity. Immediately following the White House announcement of this executive order, the Family Research Council's Peter Spriggs stated, "This level of coercion is nothing less than viewpoint blackmail that bullies into silence every contractor and subcontractor who has moral objections to homosexual behavior." He continued, "People with deeply held convictions regarding the morality of certain types of behavior should not be bound by the dictates of President Obama's agenda." The left has been trying to pass a bill with the Orwellian title, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, ENDA, for 2 decades. They haven't succeeded. But this order ignores Congress and goes a long way toward enacting ENDA by presidential fiat. After the decision in the Hobby Lobby case, it's clear the Supreme Court, albeit narrowly, will still protect the religious liberty of employers. This did not stop this administration from forcing companies with religious owners to disregard their convictions about the morality of certain types of behavior. A senior administration official noted that the Hobby Lobby decision did not involve federal contracts, saying, "We were comfortable moving forward with this executive order in light of Hobby Lobby." In other words, since the Hobby Lobby decision protected the religious liberties of a narrow subset of companies, the White House was determined to force this agenda on another big chunk of employers, federal contractors. Folks, it's becoming clearer by the week. Christians with their biblical morality and bothersome tendency to insist on adhering to it in all aspects of their lives are simply in the left's way as it tries to make sweeping changes. The secular left wants no accommodation for the religious views of ordinary Americans. This particular executive action is another example of the left's bullying of Christians, trying to force their worldview out of the workplace and the culture and confine it to the pews. So what do? Matt Barber, law professor and cultural commentator, wrote at WND.com, "For 2,000 years, whenever such conflicts have arisen, Christians have placed the laws of God above the laws of men. The question is, will Christians stand? We must." For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
1-800-351-1212. We haven't taken many phone calls today, but let's take one. We'll go to Annabelle in Georgia, WGNN. I think you'd like to share something, and I think it would be a great way to kind of capsulize some of the things we've been talking about on the program today.
Thank you. I was thinking of Obama having made a statement early on that he'd like to fundamentally change this country. And so I came across a quote by historian Will Durand that says, "A great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself from within."
Right.
And I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, Will Durant, certainly. And there have been others that have written about that before. Many people have argued, and you see the rise and fall of the Roman Empire and all sorts of things, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and some of these great writings that have said that really a country usually falls from within, and then later when the barbarians are at the gate. And we're going to talk a little bit about that with Pat Buchanan on Monday, interestingly enough, because he's kind of a student of history. Then we will look at barbarians taking over the country, but the reality is it fell from within a long time before that.
Right. I think it was you that sent me both of us, this article by Krauthammer today in National Review, The Vacant Presidency. But they're talking about Obama just being so ineffective, but it's really on foreign policy. He's very effective in what he wants in domestic policy, but that's what's making us weak. As you said, just the whole fiber of the country is becoming weak, economically weak. We can't have a good foreign policy if we're so weak economically and morally. And so it's happening from within, but then also from without, he's acting like he doesn't really care.
We've got Ed Klein on this week, of course, blood feud, and that's one of the things that surfaced there. He's talking about the feud between the Clintons and the Obamas, but, nevertheless, something else is just and even his friends are saying this president is just so disconnected. He just really is not interested in foreign policy issues. But back to a point we made just a minute ago, this idea of imperial presidency. Debbie, don't you have some facts and figures on this issue? Because obviously on Monday, when we talked with Pat Buchanan about his book, I do want to ask him one question, because he wrote a seminal article a couple of weeks ago about impeachment being a bridge too far. But at the same time, we'll get into that issue of impeachment, and having served in the Nixon administration when he was threatened with impeachment, having been somebody who articulated the argument for impeachment when Bill Clinton was in office, now he has some expertise. But you've got some facts and figures here just on some of the people that believe the impeachment of the president is a possibility.
Yes, this is actually a CNN poll, and I actually mentioned who did the poll, because you do have to look sometimes who conducted a poll to figure out whether they were trying to shift it a certain way. But CNN is certainly no friend of conservatism. So this is a CNN poll that said that 33% of Americans want President Obama impeached. I just found that staggering. I think that is, in fact, there was another thing even almost more interesting. Close to 1 in 2, so close to 50% of Americans think Obama has excessively expanded the powers of the presidency. So it's a really inspiring thing, or a signal of hope that Americans are seeing that what he's doing is not just a difference in left-wing views and right-wing views, but kind of tearing out the roots of the idea of America, of there's an executive branch with certain kind of jobs and a role in the Constitution, and the legislative has different ones, and judicial. So people are starting to see that. I'm not, by bringing this up, advocating that occur, because I think it has all sorts of risks and dangers. Right. But I do think that it's important to recognize people are alert to him, and so we on the conservative side should be more comfortable critiquing, not in a personal way, but critiquing his conduct and pointing out is far afield from the way the American presidency is supposed to act.
And I think, of course, there's another election, a congressional election coming up, and only 2 more years of the Obama presidency. And certainly you can neutralize some of it if you get the right Congress. I mean, he's always had at least both or one house of Congress up until perhaps this November. He may not continue his last 2 years having them. Now, that will unleash his, executive activities and regulatory activities. He will do those things. But I think perhaps if he doesn't have a Senate or a House behind him or that party, perhaps he will be a little more restrained. I don't know.
I have a thought about that, which is he doesn't ever have to face election again. So all he's doing now till the end of his presidency is going as far as he can in fundamentally transforming America. So if, as I hope, the Senate gets a Republican majority and the House holds on to theirs, the job of those people is going to really be to watch President Obama and decide, is he pushing the envelope too far beyond what his responsibilities are, to the point that we need to take further action against him. I know there's a lawsuit pending. House Speaker Boehner has a lawsuit heading toward President Obama, but I think that the people, what you really want to have is people in Congress who are just willing to speak out and have the pressure of the American people pointing out how far afield Obama's conduct is from his proper role in the Constitution. But I think he's going to be more uncontrollable, more executive orders, because he feels there's no consequence.
I guess the main thing Congress can do is pass a law to overturn specific executive orders. And, that's like a no-brainer. Some of these things, like, for instance, you mentioned earlier in the program that Congress could come in. Oh, of course, we have all this reticence on the part of pastors from speaking about candidates from the pulpit. Congress could come in and pass a law that clarifies that they can constitutionally. And they haven't done that.
Absolutely, yeah. Do you want to go into that subject
right
now?
We only have a few minutes, so better.
Okay. We have in the IRS code, we have churches have a specific category on a 501c3, just saying if you're a religious organization, you're a church, you're exempt from taxes, federal taxes, and part of that language in the Internal Revenue Code says, but it describes what you can and cannot do, and it says, the Johnson Amendment says, you cannot talk about politics from the pulpit. And people challenge that regularly. There's a group that's worked on it for years trying to say that's not right, that pastors cannot speak politically. So that issue comes to a head every year as this, and I'm losing it, Alliance
Defending Freedom.
Yeah.
And it's since September where they're encouraging pastors. We've even had pastors call into this program that actually stood in the pulpit and gave their sermon and then sent a copy of their sermon to the IRS because, and again, got a lawyer here so she can address this, you have to have standing. They want to challenge that in the court, and until the IRS threatens to withdraw the 501c3 tax-exempt status of a church, no one has standing. So Eric Stanley's been working to try to develop standing, right? And that's
the Freedom from Religion Foundation now is challenging these sermons, so they may actually get somewhere in a lawsuit.
Yeah, that group is trying to urge the IRS to start actually monitoring pastors' sermons so they can find the ones they say cross line into political. And you know what's so amazing is
these pastors are sending their sermons to the IRS. It's not like you don't need to monitor them every year. There's like about 50 pastors that on September, whatever date it will be this year, that Sunday, do give the sermon and then send a copy of it to the IRS to see if some of them will sue them so that they can actually have standing in court.
Right, they're kind of egging them on. And what the point I had made earlier was, while I love the idea of having it be resolved through litigation, and maybe that's how it has to be, Congress could solve the whole problem by just simply
legislation.
Right, by legislation, just getting rid of the Johnson Amendment and saying, and just removing as a condition so churches are still tax exempt and there is no prohibition on political speech. It'd be a lot easier.
Yeah, it was just added as an amendment in 1954. Was an attempt to prevent the Hunt brothers from saying anything nasty about him in the campaign. It wasn't really intended to affect churches, just 501c3 organizations, and that's because in 1948, landslide Lyndon, won by what I think would be what we call today voter irregularities. And so, nevertheless, we will wind down our program for today. Let me just mention, I mentioned a few people will be on next week. We've talked about Pat Buchanan will be on. We're going to have Representative Frank Wolf, so we're going to talk about some of the Middle East issues. We will be talking with Ed Klein about blood feud. We have also Wayne Allen Root, his book, Murder of the Middle Class. Ray Comfort's going to be on. It's quite a list of individuals that are going to be part of the program next week, so I hope that you'll join us every single day. But I want to, around the roundtable, thank both of you. This has just been a rousing, fast-paced, multi-topic issue. So let's do this again. Thank you both for being here today.
Could stick around another hour probably and still not cover it. We'll say goodbye. Have a nice weekend.
If you want to know more about Penna Dexter, you can click on her commentary. That will give you information. You want to know more about Debbie? We have her book listed today, Ladies, Can We Talk, if you'd like to get it. Or also, if you go to Today on Point of View, and under her bio and her picture there, you can also find a link, and you're available to speak. So especially when we talk about the war on women, if you want to educate women, Debbie can do that for you as well. I want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Chris for their help behind the scenes. We have, of course, a weekend coming up and a really busy week of interviews next week. We'll see you back there then.
You have been listening to Point of View. For materials offered on the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.